Will I be allowed to eat next week if I cut his hair poorly? Well, no, Father Joachim took care of us next week. Detroit sent him all of his monies, so and we only spent half of it this week. So next week is covered.
I don't think no, half of next week is covered.
Oh, half of next week is covered.
Yeah.
No, Father Joachim took care of us next week. Detroit sent him all of his. We'll have to go to eggs and ramen.
Yeah. Oh, you're gonna love this. If you ever go to Samaritan, to 48 Avenue, which is likely that you will, there's a game that we play, and then we have like a certain amount of money, so we're trying not to.
What microphone is this using?
That's why that guy was so scared. He knew. His heart was written on it. I'm just picturing
Hell, Mike.
Oh, there's nothing we need to worry about there.
Everyone's got one story.
I mean, I don't know.
Oh, there you go. There you go. I got you now.
Are you hearing me?
Because I heard you say what microphone is this now. So I can hear. You're getting. I can now hear myself.
Can you hear me very clearly?
That's missing a hole. No, like that's missing. It's a donut. Like a hole. But it's calling it a donut hole. Yeah, right. That's not. They are crazy.
Yes.
And they didn't even come from.
Now you're
It's just a donut.
I think we're okay now.
Can you hear me now? I think one of the novices probably sabotaged the thing. They wanted a free day.
We all showed up in the chapel for midday prayer.
I wasn't there.
And you weren't, and it was about 11:50 when we said free morning probably meant no midday prayer as well.
Not necessarily. I can't always be there. Okay, can you hear? Is it coming through? Testing, testing. Okay, thank you very much. All right. Well, for those of you who are not Dominican novices and who might be watching the live stream now that we have it working, I'm Father Dave Wright. I'm Father Luke's replacement so that he can be out of town. And my name is Dave Wright. I'm the novice master for the Dominicans. And I like to begin these sessions with a very familiar prayer. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Mary, Mother of the Word incarnate, Mother of the Word within us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So the topic that Father Luke asked me to deal with today is that of the liturgical calendar. Not just any liturgical calendar, but that for the Roman Catholic Church. So we'll work on that. But first of all, I want to put that in a context. Because any community, any worshiping community, when it gathers to celebrate and express its beliefs that constitute it as a community, does so through various kinds of rituals. You can go to any religious group. And it's these rituals that give meaning to its worship life. I like to classify these rituals under three headings. The first would be life. Rituals that impact life. Just the normal things. Birth. For instance, the sacraments of initiation would be one example of that. Death, funeral rites. Sickness, anointing of the sick, care of the sick. And then a community needs continuity. And it achieves that through marriage, ordination, in different ways, of course, but it continues to make the, all right. Okay. The second one is going to deal with space. That's where one encounters the divine. Now, Roman Catholics and Christians in general don't do too much about that, but primitive cultures did a great deal about that. You think of, for instance, the kivas in some of these villages in the southwest, where you went down into it, and there was a hole there. And that was the center of the universe as far as that group was concerned. Okay. And, but we don't do things like that. We do dedicate churches, for example, as a place where we gather. And there are shrines, there are sanctuaries, Lourdes, Fatima, etc., etc. And the third word is time. Communities use time to commemorate the myth. And I don't use that in the sense that a myth is something that's unreal or untrue, but it's that which gives focus and meaning to the life of that community. So for us, we could talk about the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus as being a Christian myth that will give us meaning. We do that in time. Sometimes we do it during a day, sometimes a week, sometimes a longer period of time that we call seasons. A calendar, if you look in the dictionary, they're going to tell you something like this. It's a system of determining the beginning, the length, and the end of a year, for example. So, questions like, when does the year begin? January 1st for us, March 25th for some medievals, etc. There have been many times that a year began. How many days does a month have? That's important. And then more important are when are the federal holidays. Now, a liturgical calendar is a system of determining how the worship of a particular community is organized. So we're going to be dealing with time in various aspects. We can ask questions like, how do you measure it? When does the time begin? How do you define sacred time, for example? Some primitive cultures will look at time as a kind of cyclic thing. And the new year was a time when the world put back together again, and you renew time. And that happens yearly, all the time. The myth of the eternal return, as the Eliade would put it. And then there's linear time, and that's a particularly Jewish contribution. That is, something happens. The Lord makes a promise to Abraham, and nothing will ever be the same. It goes on. Jesus died for us on the cross. Nothing will be the same for Christians. Okay. So currently, the Roman Catholic Church follows what is known as the Roman calendar. It was issued in 1969, and we have been using it since January 1st, 1970. So that's a little more than 50 years. What I'm going to do with that document is, first of all, go through it kind of in order, but I'll say what it says. I'll comment on it. Sometimes I may give some historical background for how we got there. And then we'll look at what does that mean today for us. So, if you turn to chapter 1 under the Roman calendar, the first thing it's going to tell you is that the principles employed here of determining time will apply to the Roman Rite and any other Latin rites of the Western Church. But the practical working out of it refers only to the Roman Rite. Now, for example, you may or may not know that the province of Milan, Italy, follows what is known as the Ambrosian Rite. It's a Latin rite. It's a little different than the Roman Rite and has been for centuries. It continues, it flourishes in that one archdiocese. So, the principles apply to it, but not the way you organize it and celebrate it. Okay. The liturgical day. In general, we have two ways of calculating that. The first is simply midnight to midnight, like everybody else calculates the day today. However, there are going to be celebrations when we employ a Jewish way of determining the day, and that will be from sundown to sundown. So, it's like anticipating Eucharist on Saturdays. You begin the celebration of Sunday on Saturday evening. That has some influence on how we celebrate. In the early church, the Paschal mystery of the death and resurrection of Jesus was celebrated on the first day of the week. Now, they didn't think of it in terms of the passion, death, and resurrection, but it was the Lord's Day, and we find that in the Scriptures already, in the New Testament. The calendar refers to that as the original feast day. And they say that we're going to make we intend to make Sunday a primary concern for developing this calendar. So that was one of the principles. There are also going to be days when you celebrate the Lord, the Blessed Virgin, the saints, and so on. And those days have names. They could have said, well, we're going to have a little pecking order here, 1, 2, and 3, A, B, and C, but they didn't do it that way. They used the terms solemnity, feast, and memorial, which are, the memorials will have two kinds. Then you have the weekdays. You might call them the green days. They do not celebrate any particular aspect of the mystery of salvation, and they have a pecking order. For instance, Ash Wednesday is a weekday as far as the liturgical calendar is concerned, but it's a weekday that's going to knock everything off the map. It takes top place. There are other days like that. Holy Week, for example. And even some seasons will have sections where weekdays have a predominance. So let's just think a little bit about the first great feast day, Sunday. As I said, the Scriptures already refer to it. The first day of the week, that's when the resurrection occurred. All four gospel writers, Acts of the Apostles, the appearance of Jesus in the upper room, Sunday. We have it called the Lord's Day in certain books. Early Christian literature will just use that terminology. So the Lord's Day becomes a technical term for that great feast day. However, by the mid-2nd century, maybe even a little bit earlier, it was the death and resurrection of Jesus that gave definition to Sunday observance. It gave content and it gave meaning. Now, at the same time, there was a considerable portion of the Christian community, particularly those of Judeo-Christian origin, that observed the Sabbath as well as Sunday, taking that in from a Jewish tradition. And that goes on well into the 4th century. That great feast day will begin to develop. And we call that the cycle of the year, when the whole mystery of salvation, from the incarnation to Pentecost Sunday, is covered one way or another. Now, the way the calendar looks at this, it looks at first the development. Okay, we had Sunday, the great feast day. Then they're going to talk about a special Sunday, when you particularly celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus in a more fulsome way, if you will. It's too early to call it Easter. It's too early to talk about a Triduum, but that's what it will develop into. Then the calendar will look at how that feast day, now I'm going to use the term Triduum, continues on. What's the length of time? And we talk about Easter season, another 50 days. So that's a 50-day celebration. Then it will look at how do you prepare for this feast day, Lent. Okay. You can do the same thing with Christmas and Advent. All right. Now, let's just look at what begins to happen to Sunday as it develops and expands into this thing we call a Triduum. So the first question is, what do we celebrate? Early Christian interpretation will initially view what Jesus accomplished through his death on the cross in terms of the Passover, a Jewish concept that Christ is our Pasch is sacrificed, Paul writes. So it's an interpretive lens, if you will, for the event, for the mystery, viewed through the Passover. We don't know what they did in the early church for this. We can presume that Eucharist was maybe a part of it. It seemed to be. But we could also assume that the manner in which it is celebrated is going to be influenced by the culture of the community. So you're going to have Judeo-Christian communities and Gentile Christian communities. The second question is, when do we celebrate this mystery? There are two traditions in the church by the 2nd century. Two traditions which are in conflict. The Judeo-Christian communities will say, well, we should do it at the same time as the Jewish Passover, because that's when the lambs were killed and so on. And that would be before sundown on the 14th of the month, Nisan. Okay. The Gentile Christian community is going to say, no, it should be the first day of the week. It should be on a Sunday. And eventually they come up with this formula that it should be celebrated on Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Vernal equinox is when? Roughly around March 21st, 22nd. Okay. So you get to the 21st of March, and when's the next new full moon? The next Sunday after that. That's how you determine how Easter. And that's still the way we are determining it these days. Okay. In the two sides basically agree to disagree. But in the 2nd to the 4th centuries, and you have to deal with centuries at this point, there is a shift. There are two shifts. One is going to be the date. Gradually, Sunday celebration will displace those who want the 14th Nisan. And the Council of Nicaea, 325, mandates Sunday. That's not acceptable to many Christians at the time. And so in 341, the Council of Antioch excommunicates all those who are doing it on the 14th Nisan. If you can't convince them, bring in the law. Okay. There's a shift also in the theme from using the Jewish Passover as a lens to interpret what Jesus did on the cross. It moves into a Pauline approach, which talks about death and resurrection and baptism and our entrance into that mystery of death and resurrection. That's a tradition that develops. Free footnote for all of our considerations this afternoon. The 4th century is a time of immense development of liturgical systems throughout the whole Christian world. Christianity in 313 is accepted as a reputable religion in the Roman Empire. It will be a little time before it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. But they begin to historicize in a way, to look at that mystery in various ways. It's hard for us to think of the whole thing at once. We human beings, we separate things out and talk about this and that. So now, we're going to talk about 3 days. If you go to Ambrose of Milan, he dies in 397, he will talk about celebrating the day, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, when Christ suffered, lay in the tomb, and was raised. You can go to someone like Augustine, who dies in 410. He uses the same kind of lens to interpret how the development is going. Give another 50 years, Leo I, same thing. Okay. It also becomes a time when they initiate new members into the community, sacraments of initiation. It's also a time when the church develops a process of public penance for those who have committed very serious sins, and they have to be very serious. Murder, apostasy, etc. Not I talk badly about my neighbor. Okay. They will begin to develop a preparatory fast to celebrate these 3 days. A fast that is on Friday and Saturday of the Triduum. Gradually it extends back and you have the whole week, which we now call Holy Week. Eucharist will conclude the vigil. Jerusalem is the place that is developing all of this. Christian tourism begins in the 4th century. They are coming to see the places where Jesus did these things, and the local church develops ways to deal with that. So there's a sort of historicization of how you look at the mystery. That's the first stage. The second stage begins in the 5th century and ends in 1955. So that's quite an extent. What happened in the 5th century? Well, adult baptism began to wane, and we began to have infant baptism becoming the normal practice. So the whole initiation process begins to implode upon itself. Eucharistic communion is therefore on the decline. The process of public penance is gradually becoming extinct. I'm not going to go into reasons for all of that. By the 9th century, we have a new lens to look at this celebration. It's a 3-day feast which gives way to talking about 2 Triduum. You have the Triduum of the Passion, which is going to be Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and the Triduum of the Resurrection, which will be Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And Just a free footnote, if you look at the liturgical books of the 13th century, and again in the early 1950s, they will have that two triduo kind of approach to the mystery. All right. Now the third stage is 1955 to the present, and in 55 there was a move on the part of the Roman congregation to restore the Easter Vigil and the 3 days. And from then on, we're doing pretty much what we're doing now. That is the development of the feast, the major feast that gives meaning to our worship and our life. But it extends for 50 days. The 50 days are viewed not in terms of 50 individual days, one after another, but as a period of time during which a number of things will happen. You're not supposed to kneel during those 50 days. That would be a denial of the resurrection. Okay. The Alleluia begins to come in and define that in a way. The administering of baptism, theoretically it still happens at the vigil, but practically not. Okay. Towards the end of the 4th century, and of course that's liturgical development throughout the 4th century, they begin to separate it out. So you celebrate Easter Sunday. You celebrate Ascension 40 days later, following Lucan chronology. You celebrate Pentecost Day. And they're viewed as separate celebrations. The unitive character of all of that in the mystery of redemption is lost. Now, that today, I'm not going to go into the details of our Triduum. You've all experienced it, I'm sure. But we do begin on Holy Thursday. And notice that the 3 days now are viewed in terms of Jewish calculation. From the evening Mass on Thursday to the Passion on Friday. From the Passion on Friday to the Vigil. From the Vigil to the Easter Vespers. At this point, let me stop and say, are there any questions that come to your mind? Or shall I go on? Yes?
When you said baptism after 1955 would be celebrated theoretically but not practically?
No, up until 55 it would be there. But after the restoration of the Easter Vigil in 55, baptism becomes a part of that, again, in a practical way. Theoretically, it was always there. Except, the Easter Vigil until 55 in our time had been celebrated on Saturday morning, not evening. That's a whole different kind of thing, where I'm not going to go into. Okay. The revision of the calendar sections that will 3 times go through that Acts of the apostles. The second reading will be from various epistles or Revelation. But then the Gospels will define the Sundays. For example, Easter Sunday morning, it's in all cycles, Mary Magdalene at the tomb, Peter and John running to the tomb. The second Sunday, it's always Thomas, Easter Eve, 1 week later. Third Sunday is an appearance of Jesus of some kind. Fourth Sunday, it's a Good Shepherd theme. Fifth, sixth, and seventh, selections from the prayer, priestly prayer of Jesus at the Last Supper. And Pentecost, just the events of the day. So that's giving greater definition to the Sundays, but it's also giving variety through the 3-year cycle. Okay, enough of that. So we've seen the feast, the Triduum, the extension of it through the Easter season, now the preparation for it. Lent today has 2 foci. Preparing catechumens for the sacraments of initiation and preparing the faithful for renewal of their baptismal commitment. And it runs from Ash Wednesday up to the Mass of the Lord's Supper. Okay. Although we do have a special segment in there that we call Holy Week. All right. Now I want to deal with Roman development because that's what affects us. The Eastern rites and so on were developing their way of doing it. Until the late 2nd century, there's only a simple 2-day fast. By the mid-3rd century, that had expanded to 6 days. By the mid-4th century, so we're moving in terms of 100 years here, Lent is observed throughout the Mediterranean area. Sometimes, but with 6 weeks. Now I'm just going to say, it depends where you are and how you count the days. 40 is always but do you count Sundays, which are non-fast days? Some do, some don't. Some, here you get your Judeo-Christians and those out in the East, will look upon it Saturday and Sunday as non-fast days. That'll give you an 8-week Lent. So, pay your money, take your choice. That's what they did. It will develop. Eventually, the Roman West will add more days of preparation. You get a 5th Quinquagesima, you get another week. Sexagesima, you get another week. Septuagesima. All right. We older guys would have heard those and have celebrated. Another little note, ashes were not, we think Ash Wednesday, we always define it with ashes. That didn't happen until almost 1200. So that's a late kind of custom. fasting and how you do it will also define those days. I'm not going to go into variations on that. And again, the Sundays of Lent is rather clearly defined by initiation, for example. So you'll always, I'm going to use cycle A for an example, but all 3 cycles will have the temptation of Christ on the first Sunday. All 3 cycles will have the transfiguration of Christ on the second. And after that, in the first A cycle, you will have John, the Samaritan woman at the well, the man born blind, the raising of Lazarus. And there you have a thematic that's used in the initiation rites. Water with the Samaritan woman, light with the man born blind, life with Lazarus. Those are lenses in which you look at the initiation process and give it interpretation. Just an example. Now, let's see where we are in the year. Okay. The second big festive cycle will be that of Christmas and Advent. And again, it starts with Christmas. We'll talk about Christmas time, and then Advent is preparation. Now, the evidence and the way in which we talk about Easter, Easter season, Lent, is really quite clear. We have all kinds of evidence for that. When you get to Christmas, it is a mess, quite frankly, in terms of how it's organized and where it came from. Although the calendar will tell you, quote, no more ancient custom than celebrating the memorial of the nativity of the Lord and of his first manifestations is what Christmas time is about. The very first time that we have any evidence that Christmas was celebrated, say in the city of Rome, comes in the mid-4th century. We can surmise that about the year 330 to 335, it was first beginning to be celebrated in the city of Rome. So it's a late comer in terms of the development. Today, it begins, of course, with evening prayer or vespers of Christmas Eve, and it concludes with, and here you have to dance around a little bit, the Sunday after Epiphany, or after January 6th, whichever comes first. Why is that? Well, because Epiphany, of course, used to be celebrated in the West on January 6th. The church now celebrates it on this Sunday. It moves it wherever January 6th it doesn't make any difference. You move it to the Sunday between January 2nd and January 8th. Now that's an interesting thing because we do that with Ascension too, and some other feasts. Why did they think that was going to be a better way to do it? Quite frankly, most Christians didn't observe those days. Ascension Thursday, yeah, but not a whole lot. And if you're going to bring that dimension into the death, resurrection of Jesus, Sunday was a better option. Move it to the 7th Sunday of Easter season. Same thing with Epiphany. So now we celebrate it regularly. Okay. Advent itself is going to have, like Lent, is going to have a twofold character. It's a time to prepare to celebrate Christmas, but it's a time when our minds and hearts are asked to look forward to the second coming of Christ, to the end times. They have a phrase, they describe Advent as a period of devout and expectant delight. It's a lovely season, I think. Okay. And of course, first Sunday of Advent up until Christmas. There is a special segment in Advent, however. The days from December 17th to the 23rd take on a special character as we are approaching Christmas Day, the Nativity of the Lord, and the events that immediately preceded in the infancy narratives of Luke and Matthew. All right. Now, with Christmas, you can have a little fun. For the first 3 centuries, Rome and the West basically didn't have a Christmas celebration. In the 4th century, of course, the mystery of salvation begins to be historicized. And you want to celebrate individual aspects of it. Well, what is certain? The certain thing that we know is that the date of celebration in the city of Rome is going to be roughly 330 to 335. It's because we have a document which it was done for a wealthy Christian gentleman whom we don't know the name of, but it was done by a man named Philocalus, and so it's called the Philocalian calendar. And what he does in 2 different places, he has 2 lists of festivals. One will be the civil festivals of Rome, and the other will be the celebrations of Christians. And when you check December 25th, in the civil listing, it will be called the birthday of the unconquered Son, Sol Invictus. In the list of the Christian celebrations, it will be the birth of Christ in Bethlehem of Judea. Now what that does, it tells you the kind of dichotomy of the Roman world in the 4th century. They have pagan backgrounds, they're getting Christian input, but we're going to take care of both. Constantine had coinage. On one side he had Christ crucified, on the other side he had Sol Invictus. He was hedging his bets. Wasn't quite sure, although he got baptized eventually. January 6th, Epiphany. The first evidence of that is in the 5th century, about 450. And that's Pope Leo I. In a homily that he gives, he indicates that this celebration of the Epiphany is a rather new thing. So, there. Now, why do they pick December 25th for the? There are 2 conflicting hypotheses for this. One is simply going to say, well, the Christian community wanted to baptize a pagan holiday and kind of make it its own and overcome it, and so they picked it December 25th. However, its origins, however, whatever they were thinking, it does have some relationship to the winter solstice. And here we get a light theme again. They followed the Julian calendar in Rome at that time. had pretty much taken Rome and the Roman Empire by storm at this time, and it was rampant among the pagan groups. So to say, you could use a light symbolism, and Christ is the light of the world. December 25th, the solstice, is the darkest day of the year, but the light is going to overcome the darkness, and therefore it's a perfect way to celebrate the birth of Christ. All right. The Council of Nicaea in 325 proclaimed the dogma that Jesus Christ is God, equal in substance with the Father. That was to counteract the heresy of Arius, which was rampant even in Christian circles. And that's 325. The beginning of celebrating December 25th as the day of the birth of the God-man follows very quickly. Again, you see, I think, the Christian community beginning to use this day, December 25th, as a way to counteract the Arian heresy, and so on. But the fun thing about this is a hypothesis which is known as the calculation hypothesis. Okay. The Christians in the 4th century were curious a lot about the life of Jesus, the date of his birth, and so on. And if one sets the day of his birth on December 25th because of the winter solstice, you can begin to calculate things. For example, if we assume that that is the birth date of Jesus, and Jesus is a human being, must have been conceived 9 months before, so that would be at the spring equinox, March 25th, roughly. And the Annunciation has something to do with that. It becomes a day to celebrate the Annunciation. But we know from Luke that right after the Annunciation, Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, who was in her 6th month. So if we calculate back 6 months, we find that John the Baptist must have been conceived at September. Not an equinox, well, the equinox, yes. Okay, equal day, equal light, equal darkness. So if it was September, thus the birth of John the Baptist would happen in June. So June 24th becomes the celebration of his birth, the summer solstice. It's all good things. However, other authors would come up with different solutions. One African managed to figure out that Jesus was born on March 28th. Clement of Alexandria, who died in 215, says that Jesus was born on May 20th. But, he said, I think it was May 18th. I like him because that's my birthday. Okay. Again, pay your money, take your choice. In the Western Latin world, and the Christmas becomes the Incarnation Feast. But there are areas in the Western world that are heavily influenced by Constantinople and the East. All of northern Italy, all of southern France, a good portion of what is Spain, and they went through the Straits of Gibraltar, and they even got to Ireland. And you find Eastern practices being used there. And one of those was that the Incarnation Feast in the East was Epiphany. Epiphany celebrates the baptism of Jesus. It celebrates the birth of Jesus. They weren't big on the Magi at the beginning. And so you've got another tradition coming in, and it's coming together. Eventually, Rome will be celebrating Epiphany, and the East will be celebrating December 25th, and so will all of Western Europe. So you get that together. All right. Some history about that. Not too much, but we have a tradition, a Roman tradition, of 3 Masses on Christmas Day. The third Mass of Christmas is the earliest one. In the 5th century, the Pope used to celebrate one Mass on Christmas Day. It was at St. Peter's, roughly about 9 a.m. in the morning, and then he'd go to bed. Well, actually, probably not. But he would later in the night, the late evening, go over to Mary Major, or what we call Mary Major today, and there he would celebrate the midnight office. This is the day before St. Mary Major's. He would celebrate Mass in the oratory that was there, and then he would celebrate morning prayer or lauds, and then he went off to rest. So we have that. Give another 100 years, and we get a Mass at dawn, because on his way back from St. Mary Major's, he would stop by at the Church of St. Anastasia, who was Eastern, and that's where the imperial representatives to the papal Rome were living, and he would celebrate a Mass for the Eastern representatives. So you get those 3. Mass during the night. That's the St. Mary Major one. Mass in the day, that's the oldest one. But in between, you also get Mass at dawn. So that's a tradition there. Another little liturgical historical note. Jump ahead to Charlemagne, so we're talking about very late 700s and early 800s. He wants to use liturgy as a way of unifying his kingdom, so he sends to Rome and asks the Pope, send me some books that we can use and copy and spread throughout the empire. And the Pope says, we don't want to send him any of our good ones, the ones we're using now. There are a couple back in the sacristy that we're not using anymore. Send those, which they do. And so they begin to, up in the Holy Roman Empire, so to speak, they begin to use old Roman books. And so Roman practice gets spread throughout Europe. Eventually, they're going to move all the Christmas Masses to St. Mary Major, and that becomes known as the Christmas Basilica. So there we go. All right. Christmas today. It's really a collection of various feasts. And each of these feasts are going to have some kind of a history, which I will not give you all of it. But January 1st, for example, that's the earliest Marian feast in the Roman Church. January 1st, Mary, Mother of God. And that happened again in response to the Council of Ephesus in 430, which defined that Mary was the mother of God and not just the mother of a man named Jesus. How are you going to bolster that? You rebuild a church and you call it St. Mary Major. And you're, by doing that, having a church dedicated to this idea, which is very important theologically, you promote it. Sometime, and it depends where you go. Okay, January 1st, Rome, Mary, Mother of God. You move over into Spain and southern France, and somehow, because of the one-liner in Luke, it becomes known as the Feast of the Circumcision of Christ, which is in the Gospel reading for that day. But it's just one verse in the Gospel. It's the beginning of the civil year. Recently, Pope St. John Paul II made it a day of prayer for peace. So it has a varied kind of history. You're going to have other feasts, like the Holy Family. That's a 19th century feast, like Canada. Eventually it gets spread into the entire church. Epiphany, of course, which is the incarnation feast for Eastern rites. But the Three Kings theme that we associate with Epiphany doesn't really come into existence until the 6th century. And Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar get their names about the 9th century. Okay. Today, we conclude the Christmas season with the baptism of the Lord. That would be celebrated in the East and as part of Epiphany. But if you look at our texts for Epiphany, you're going to find that we're commemorating the birth of Jesus, the manifestation of Jesus to the Magi, the baptism of Jesus, and it will even have the multiplication of the loaves. They are manifestations of divine power through Jesus. So you see, it's all over the place. And you could get more picky with other feasts, and that's a whole other history too. All right. Hold on. Do we need a break? Yes. Okay, it's 2:44, 45. Let's come back in about 10 minutes, okay? We will get.
What?
We will get to the saints. Do this for me, I can. church here, the ending of it. Schematically. And that had to do with where they were put in the Missal. There was a time when they were put along with the saints. You know, so are people like St. John, St. Stephen, they were all in the saints, and that was in the back of the book. But then they moved them along and moved it to the front, and you begin the season. All right. Now, Advent is a fusion of two Western traditions. First of all, one that we can identify in southern France and Spain. By the end of the 4th century, under the influence of Constantinople and so on, the incarnation feast in those areas was Epiphany. So January 6th. And so Advent became viewed there in those areas as a preparation for Epiphany. But unlike the East, they developed Epiphany as a baptismal time, a parallel. So it was like the Easter Vigil. And initiation, a parallel process to what we would have in Lent in Rome, you're going to have that in what we would call Advent leading up to Epiphany. So that changes things a little bit. With that, there is an emphasis on penitential discipline in terms of preparing, just like we would have a penitential discipline in Lent. So it's a similar kind of thing. And you're counting 40 days of preparation, just like Lent. And if you push that back from January 6th, you're going to end, depending upon how you count fast days, but you're going to end around November 11th to begin it, which is the feast of St. Martin of Tours. And so they talk about St. Martin's Lent. But it's Advent. Okay. Now, in the 6th century, after the Germanic invasions and the destruction, really, of the structures of the Roman world in the West, the Irish monks come over to re-evangelize the areas that had been in France, in that area, and their preaching for re-evangelization focused on the end times, repentance, penance, final judgment. And so, call it Advent if you will, but it has a very strong penitential aspect to it. So, because it's a penitential area or time, you're not going to have a Gloria. You're not going to use the Alleluia. You're not going to sing the Te Deum, and you're going to use purple vestments. Okay? Focus upon the second coming of Christ and your reconversion. Okay. Rome doesn't have any of that baptismal connection with Epiphany. They have no tradition of baptism but as early as St. Augustine, they had one day of fast for Christmas. Gradually, that's going to expand, and by the time of Gregory the Great, 600, they have 4 Sundays of Advent, 4 Sunday Masses, and they will do what we used to call Ember Days. But it's a preparation for Christmas, so we're going to have a Gloria, we're going to sing the Alleluia, and we're going to use white vestments. That's the Roman tradition. Well, you know, you get these two together, and there has to be some give and take. And by the 12th century, those two traditions had pretty much merged and returned to Rome. So the penitential tradition continues to dominate, but the compromise is that, yes, we'll use purple vestments, we will not sing the Gloria, but we will sing the Alleluia. Okay? There you have it. Two traditions, tradition of Rome, tradition of Spain and southern France. So we have a tradition of 4 weeks of Advent, although it's interesting, the committee thought about possibly instituting a 6-week Advent, which would be sort of parallel to Lent. In the end, they did not do that. But they did, the lectionary created daily readings, especially from the prophet Isaiah as a first reading. And the gospel themes are very well set. The first Sunday always deals with the end times. So that's a kind of carryover from the end of ordinary time. The second Sunday is going to deal with John the Baptist, but in the sense that we need to prepare for the Lord's coming. Not just at the end of time, but in history and in our lives. The third Sunday is also going to focus on John the Baptist, but it focuses upon Christ already present. Who is this? Are you the one we're supposed to be looking for, or shall we look for another? That kind of thing. So, words that might characterize those Sundays, the first one would be vigilance, stay awake. The second one, John the Baptist, prepare. The third is a question. Who is this Jesus? And the fourth is right in the middle of December 17th to the 23rd, one of those days, and it focuses on the immediate events preceding the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. And so it also focuses on Mary. And the theme is going to be incarnation. It's very closely worked out. And because they could do it from scratch. They didn't have any tradition of doing readings during the week. But the days of December 17th to the 23rd, when we celebrate the immediate event preparing for the birth of Christ, the infancy narratives, the readings are going to be chosen with the gospel text in mind. So you have the New Testament readings, for example, Matthew's genealogy, Joseph's dream, the Annunciation of Zechariah, the Annunciation of Mary, visitation of Elizabeth, Mary's Magnificat. John the Baptist is named John. Zechariah is Benedictus, 17th to the 24th. And you're going to have appropriate messianic prophecies linked. So you have a thematic link in the last days of Advent. And you also have what we call the O antiphons. Again, taking Old Testament names, O wisdom, O leader, root of Jesse, etc., Emmanuel, O king, radiant dawn. They are used at the Magnificat at evening prayer and at the gospel acclamation in those days. So that's what it looks like. Okay. hang on. We're now into ordinary time. That time during which no particular aspect of the mystery of Christ is celebrated. Okay. Now, there is a little historical development with regard to this. In the early days, there were no consistent pattern of readings for Sundays. There were no weekly readings, for example. Sunday was the day for Eucharistic celebration. Wednesday, the day on which Christ was betrayed, Friday, the day on which Christ died, were often fast days. And Saturday was often viewed as a fast day as well, but not a Eucharistic day. None of those. Mid-5th century, you're going to begin to see that on some of those days, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, the Christian community assembled, but didn't celebrate Eucharist. They're more for instruction. It's not until about the 6th century that these days of assembly also become days of Eucharistic celebration. And it's not until the 8th century that Thursday gets a day of Eucharistic celebration, and you have the whole week. Now, what are you going to do with that? You have no pattern of readings, no lectionary, no 2-year cycle. Well, Charlemagne's time, Alcuin of York, comes up with the idea that on certain days we will have certain intentions, sort of votive masses, if you will. Now, there are going to be all kinds of series that you could follow in the Middle Ages. However, this is what he did. Sunday, we're going to devote that to the Holy Trinity. Monday, for purification from sins. Tuesday, for the aid of the angels. Wednesday, for holy wisdom. Thursday, for charity. Friday, the Holy Cross. Saturday, Mary. So some of those carry over into what we do today. But they became a kind of, you had to fill in the weekday with something, and they used various themes, mainly devotional. It wasn't until the Second Vatican Council, when the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy number 51 mandated a richer fare of Scripture. And out of that mandate comes what we use as our lectionary today. So we have readings for every day of the year, for every day of the season, etc. We have readings for the commons of the saints. So if we're celebrating a doctor of the church, there's some readings that could be used for him too, etc. Interesting, the Roman lectionary as we currently have it is the mother, if I can use that term, for lectionaries in the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, the Methodist, the Presbyterian, and also in some other denominations. It's used, they did a terrific job. Nothing's perfect, of course, except that ones who put it together think it's a great deal. But the influence of that has brought a unity among Christian denominations in terms of how they view the year and what are the readings and so on. I know, for example, the Episcopal Cathedral in South Bend, Indiana, when we published the Roman lectionary, they simply bought one and used it. Okay, something's happening there. But by the Middle Ages, Sunday had lost its paschal character. The death and resurrection of Jesus was not too prominent in understanding. Very little concept of the mystery of Christ. So, how are you going to deal with this program as a program for those times of the year when we're not celebrating a season. Well, the first attempt was to say, well, let's celebrate with broadly conceived themes, something like the seasons. Could this be done during this period, I'm going to call it ordinary time just to use it? Maybe a thematic pattern for each Sunday. Well, those were the liturgists talking and speculating, and then the exegetes got into it and said, no way, no way, because this is a great danger of making Scripture say what we want it to say rather than what it says. We need something else. So any attempt to construct a thematic approach to ordinary time was rejected. Then the second attempt was to say, well, we'll use the Gospels to distribute readings throughout the year. Well, where do you start? At first, they were going to use only the words of Jesus, the certain words of Jesus, the red text. Okay? But they'd be taken out of context. They were very short. There was a limited number of them, and many of the saying those are the words of Jesus are based on exegetical hypotheses. So they rejected that. They said we're simply going to use the entire Gospels, the 4 Gospels, and they got what we have now is a 3-year cycle. ABC, Matthew, Mark, supplemented by John and Luke. And John pretty much is reserved to be used in the second part of Lent and throughout the Easter season as well. So, if you look at any year cycle, A, B, or C, the first Sunday of ordinary, it's Pentecost Sunday, it ends Easter season, so we begin on Monday, and so there is no first Sunday in ordinary time. But the second Sunday is the manifestation of the Lord, so one of those. For example, the wedding feast at Cana is used in one cycle. And then the 3rd through the 33rd Sunday is going to be a semi-continuous reading of one of the synoptic Gospels. So if it's A, it's going to be Matthew. That's what we're doing now. Then there'll be Mark, and with a little bit of help from John, and finally Luke. And then the 34th Sunday will be the feast or the solemnity of Christ the King. The first Sunday reading is chosen to unite with the gospel reading in some way, sometimes not so obvious, but a sort of thematic connection. So your first readings are selected from the Old Testament depending upon what's in the gospel reading. The second reading, readings from the epistles and so on, of Paul, etc., they will be read in cycles. So you might be reading from Romans for 6 weeks and then something else for 5 weeks, etc. Of course, we have the feasts of the Lord, solemnities of the Lord, Trinity, Corpus Christi, Sacred Heart, etc. They move around depending upon Easter. Weekday readings will do the same. The gospel reading, you'll get through all 3 synoptics from the beginning of the ministry of Jesus just up to the Passion. So, to give a little variety, so we're not reading Matthew all the time at the same time, we begin with Mark. for 9 weeks, then Matthew, and then Luke. Mark is read in its entirety, and then Matthew and Luke will come from those readings that are not found in Mark, and they supplement them. All right, that's a very quick look at ordinary time. But I think what might be of more interest to you at this time is the saints. Why are we doing what we're doing? And so, we have solemnities, feasts, and memorials. Like I said before, it could have been 1, 2, and 3, A, B, and C, but they chose those names. And the purpose of these festal days is simply to venerate the Blessed Virgin Mary, memorials of saints that are proposed to our devotion and imitation, and so on. The principle that was used in developing the sanctoral calendar, part of the calendar, is that the saints who have universal importance are celebrated in an obligatory way throughout the whole church. Other saints, not judged to be of universal importance or significance, will be in calendars of what we call particular churches, or nations, or religious families. So you have a certain hierarchy. You have the universal calendar of the saints for the Roman Church. Then you're going to have what they call a particular calendar. And that can be a nation. For instance, the United States has a particular calendar of saints that differs from the universal calendar in that it adds in certain saints that the universal does not. Some of our own. Catherine Drexel, Mother Elizabeth Seton, John Neumann, Junipero Serra, Kateri Tekakwitha, North American Martyrs, yes. Although that's in the universal calendar. But it is us too. So where does it come from? So we add those. You can go another step and say, oh, we'll have a diocesan calendar. So there are some celebrations that are done here in the Archdiocese of Denver that are not done in any other diocese in the United States, but they're added to the calendar, so you keep inserting. St. John Regis, for example. I wonder why he's celebrated here, Okay. What do I want to say? Dominicans, well, I'll throw the Dominicans in. We have a particular calendar too. Okay. But I want to talk a little bit about the principles that they use to develop this. First of all, the proper of time, so that's the seasons. Lent, Easter, Advent, Christmas, those seasons are to be kept intact. Yes, there may be some celebration of saints, but they're not going to dominate those seasons. There's to be combined in a way into the universal calendar. There are all kinds of celebrations that might have been granted, Our Lady of Loreto, for instance, in Italy and so on is a big thing. Not so much over here. Our Lady of Ransom, how many celebrate that? No. Okay. So maybe a particular order does that. Okay. So the manner in which you go about doing that can be diocesan, it can be a religious community, It can be an individual church, St. Dominic Parish. We celebrate St. Dominic's Day here as the highest solemnity that we can muster. No one else in the Denver area is going to do that. No. So, but that's because of the parish, but it's also because of us. Okay. Now, the proper date for celebrations. The church's practice has been to celebrate saints on their birthday, meaning their death day, when they enter heaven. And that goes back early. The churches, you know, human beings, they like to celebrate their heroes. And so the church had martyrs, and then they had confessors, and they had monks, and they had bishops, and so on. And each church would kind of celebrate those that they wanted. And then you'd hear in Rome that, oh, they're celebrating Saint so-and-so up in Milan. We ought to do that here. So you add it to this calendar for the city of Rome. And maybe they'll take one of ours. You know, it was a political process. And so you begin to develop calendars of various churches, various areas, and various religious groups. Now, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of how you go about that, but you should know, especially the Dominicans should know, that if you open up the Missal, you're going to find norms in the beginning, not just the germ, which you will also find, universal norms for the calendar. And in number 59, it's going to have a table of liturgical days, which gives an order for various celebrations. So they, first of all, they'll look at solemnities. And within solemnities, you're going to have a pecking order. You know, Sunday of the Resurrection, Easter Sunday, that's going to be way up there at the top. Christmas is not far behind, but St. Dominic isn't quite there. But he's on the list, you know, so you do that. So they go through the solemnities. Then they go through feasts and how that all works out. And then they'll talk about memorials and so on. So in all this, there's a pecking order. As one feast might collide with another, where do you rank on that table of liturgical days?
I was pretty curious. A feast is the days of the death of the, is that correct?
That's what they mean when they talk about the birthday of a saint. And they try to do that. But sometimes it doesn't work. Someone else, for one reason or another, someone else is already there. So, well, maybe we dug up the remains and moved them. So the transfer, or translation as they call it. For example, we used to celebrate St. Thomas Aquinas on March 7th. Well, that always fell in Lent. And so then you're subject to the Lenten regulations, which dampens down saints. But on January 28th, it's the day when they moved his remains or his relics to the cathedral in Toulouse, or, well, the Jacobin, not the cathedral. And so that's the date that they chose. For some, it might be an ordination date. You know, Pope Gregory I, we didn't celebrate him this year because he fell on the 3rd, on Sunday. But on his death date, it was already crowded, so they chose his ordination date. something that was connected with the life of the saint. But by and large, yes, it's a day of death. Okay. Now, the revision of the calendar for the saints. It has a twofold thrust. There are changes in the calendar, and there are changes in the ranking of celebrations. And I'll go through this and give you some examples. The first principle is that the number of devotional feasts was reduced. Okay, what is a devotional feast? It's one that commemorates some particular aspect of one of the events of salvation history. Celebrating one of the titles. To use that last example, Our Lady of Ransom. Anyone know when we do that? Nope, I don't know either. So, you know, but there are titles. Our Lady of Loretto, Our Lady of La Salette. Big thing in some areas, but not here. And so on. How many titles does Mary have, for example, surrounding what we would call the Immaculate Conception? In Spanish-speaking areas, it tends to be a very big thing. But it's not called the Immaculate Conception. Okay. The origin is that they really come out of the Middle Ages. And private devotions here, you use this title. I mean, we have Mary as Queen of everything under the universe. And, you know, so that's, all that is pretty much local. And some local things began to be observed more universally. You borrow from other churches, and so they found themselves into the calendar. Well, the examples that we're left with, for instance, Feasts of the Lord. Which ones remain? Well, we have Holy Trinity, Corpus Christi, Sacred Heart, Christ the King, and Holy Family is put in there. All other feasts of the Lord are put, or solemnities of the Lord rather, are put into particular calendars. So if Mexico wants to celebrate something for Mary or our Lord, okay, go ahead. But it'll be different. It won't be the same in the United States. Only the ones I mentioned are universal. Feast of Mary, of Joseph, of the angels, January 1st. They restored that to be Mary, Mother of God, the original Roman feast. And then there are other memorials and so on. I'm not going to go through the whole list. But the purpose was to focus on the devotion of the faithful, which tends to be local. Devotion usually has a local character to it. And so there are some feasts of the Lord in which Mary plays a part, like the Annunciation, the Presentation. There are other feasts which speak of, as they put it, the greater mysteries of her life. Again, like the Immaculate Conception, the Visitation, the Assumption, birth of Mary. St. Joseph, well, we have his one feast in March. And then we have a kind of secondary feast. It's a memorial. Joseph the Worker on May 1st. Just give you a free footnote on that one. Joseph the Worker is a prime example of how not to create a feast. In other words, they tried to do it from the top down. You have to do it from the bottom up. There has to be a basis of devotion someplace before something catches on. But back in the 50s, May 1st in Europe was what?
Labor Day.
It was their Labor Day. And also the Communist Party, you know, and so Rome was against it. And they thought, well, we will baptize this day and we'll make it. They made it the highest ranking that you could have of a feast. And it flopped. Why? Because there was no basis among the faithful for it. Now, over here, we celebrate Labor Day. We're not going to do that in Europe, you know, but that's a perfect day to celebrate St. Joseph the Worker. You baptize the day, in a sense, with a Christian facade. All right, now, second principle. The history of the lives of those saints found in the 1960 calendar, that's what they were working from, was subjected to critical study. Now, there are various categories here. The first one was saints who posed historical problems. Do we have any evidence or even accurate information as a historical basis for their devotion, or in many cases for their existence? We had 29 of those. They disappeared from the calendar. They were removed, with one exception. Saint Cecilia falls under that category in terms of any kind of documentation, and she's a patron of musicians, and there's probably a cardinal who had a, titular church in Rome. Anyway, she got put back in, and more recently, St. Catherine of Alexandria, who is in the same situation historically.
She's one of ours.
If she existed.
Vincent told me that.
Okay.
Don't we have a council for a martyrdom? St. Cecilia?
Evidence for her existence is very slight. But there is a point to celebrating even those people whom we maybe know don't exist, because they have a popular devotion and cult. And okay, if they're directed to God, all right.
Is that true of St. Christopher?
Yes. Yes, he was on the list too. Then there's a category of what we would call ancient Roman martyrs. There were, in the 1960 calendar, 41 of them. They were martyrs observed by the city of Rome, the church of the city of Rome. And not much is known about them. Maybe their name and so on, and their date. But of those, they removed 26. So you see, they're reducing those for various reasons. But there are remaining ones. There must be, well, I don't know the whole 1, 2, 6, 15, 16. There are 16 of those ancient Roman martyrs still on the calendar. Another area was what we call founders of the titular churches of Rome. Now, those are the parish churches, basically. And there were 8 of those, and they're all widely considered to be legendary and did not exist. But only Cecilia remains, but for other reasons. Now, here we go. Saints of universal significance. Okay, you've got a committee doing this. How are you going to do that? What would be a fair rule for judging saints of universal significance? And they say it was very hard to devise. But they came out with a couple of criteria. One, they wanted a calendar that would have a chronological balance, that is, representatives from the 1st through the 20th centuries. Also, they wanted a calendar that would have a geographical balance throughout those centuries. And every age was to be represented by someone. You know, I'll just throw this out too. The Reformation did most of Northern Europe in. And you ended up in the beginning of the 16th, by the end, beginning of the 16th, or end of the 16th century, rather, with what I call a Mediterranean Catholicism, focused on Italy, France, and Spain. And we've been dealing with that for a very long time. But it also meant that most of the canonized saints came from Italy, France, and Spain, with tons coming from Italy. Sanctity is big there. So, in any case, under this universal significance, or what about popes? Are they universally significant? 1960 had 38 popes. 26 of them were early martyrs. Others were added. Gregory the Seventh in the 12th century added a lot of popes to the calendar because he was fighting the German emperor, and he wanted to fight him on a spiritual battle as well. 15 of those remain. Then there are non-Roman martyrs, had 49 of them. 17 of those remain. Then there were saints who were not martyrs. Some were missionaries, apostles to different countries. They tended to be retained. Founders of religious orders and congregations, especially those who brought some kind of a new insight into the way religious life might be lived. All the doctors of the church get a feast day. But they did eliminate 63 that had been in the 1960 calendar. So, and those, I say, they go to particular calendars. If you want to celebrate them, put them on your calendar. Then they looked at when were the days of observance, and we've already talked a little bit about the birthday of a saint. Well, they said maybe we can move it to a free day. No, let's use St. Dominic. What day did St. Dominic die? Anyone in white? August 6th. Well, he was never celebrated on August 6th, was he? Because Transfiguration of the Lord, and the Lord kicks, you know, pecking order. Okay. So when do they put him? When are we going to do this? Well, they put him on August 4th. Why? Because the Roman feast of Our Lady of the Snows, or the dedication of the St. Mary Major, is what that feast was a Roman feast, and it took precedence. So they pushed him back another day. Then they revised this calendar, and they put him on August 7th. So for a couple of years we celebrated him on August 7th. But then St. Cajetan was the founder of an order, and that was his death date, and that was better. And Dominic, so they moved him to the 8th of August. Okay. Very applicable. Yes, all right, okay.
Is that his literal birthday?
Which?
August 8th.
Whose?
Dominic.
No. August 6th is. That,
No, but his nativity, the day Blessed Jane
We don't know that. Pious legend may speculate. Okay. What else? Okay. The calendar was to be made universal and representing everybody, every period of time. So they've added to the Roman saints or martyrs in the general calendar, saints from East and North Africa. Some from Italy, some from France, some from Spain. But all continents, Africa, Latin America, North America. That's where we get the North American martyrs. They get under that. The other way of sorting the pie is to look at the ranks of celebration. So, how many solemnities can a religious order have on its calendar? The answer? 1.
Oh, for the.
So, Dominic is there. How many feasts can it have? And we've got several. We used to have Albert the Great, but in the most recent revision, he was reduced to a memorial. So, except for us here, who live in the province of St. Albert the Great. See? So you raise the rank of the feast, you celebrate in a more fulsome way. Okay, I'm not going to give you just more of that, but it will be, those are the principles that were used in putting the calendar together. And the numbers I gave you were those that were in 1969. Things have changed. You know, new saints have been canonized. Some saints have been added to the universal calendar. U.S. keeps adding people. Molokai, what's his first name? Damien, yeah. Okay, the most recent one. Okay. Now that I haven't put you to sleep, I can tell you, I can see that, but your minds may be asleep at this point. But are there any questions at this point about anything? Oops, there's one.
When did they start wearing pink vestments? You talked about the history of Advent. When did they start wearing robes?
That's a good question. And I'll tell you, I didn't go into this, but if you look at the readings for Lent, the last 3 weeks come from John. Before that, you're going to have other Gospels. The ancient Lenten practice in Rome was to have a 3-week Lent. Very early on, though, that moved to 6 weeks. But they read John during the last 3 weeks. And that's the conflict between Jesus and the Jewish authorities. They increasingly are bitter. And so what we would call the 5th Sunday of Lent was the one in the middle. And they called it Mediana. That was the Sunday known as Mediana, in the middle. And it was to say, well, we need to celebrate a little bit because it's half over. Well, it's no longer, the 5th is no longer in the middle anymore, but that's where it came from. And rose, it's a little like the purple, but it's not so dark, and it's a little more joyful, and you know. And you do the same thing in Advent, in the 3rd Sunday.
So that color schema with the rose is as old as the purple?
No, it's later. Purple, the purple white controversy for Advent, for example, predates getting rose is a later kind of thing. Exactly when, I'm not sure. Molly.
I have a question about the saints. And you mentioned the category for the founders of religious orders.
Yeah.
Being a woman, I'm very interested if that is only religious orders for men.
No. Could be women too.
Because recently, St. Vincent de Paul
Yeah.
is one that is given that.
Founder.
Right. But Louise de Marillac was the founder of the Daughters of Charity with Vincent.
Yeah.
But I don't think she has a.
She has a feast day. I'm not sure whether it's on the, I don't think it's on the calendar. But it would be a particular calendar probably for France. You know, that,
Even though they're all over the world.
well, they're all over the world now, but I mean, in place of origin. Yeah. Okay.
So this isn't really a question, but it's an interesting Coloradan fact, and that is that St. Francis Cabrini has become, through all the controversy about Columbus Day, and nobody did anything for a while in regard to that. Now in the state of Colorado, it is the first Monday of October is Francis Cabrini Day.
Yes.
It is a state holiday, a banking holiday. So I find that like so interesting that there's such an ownership, and I guess that the state, I don't know how far they looked to find someone to be there for that holiday, but I just love the fact that they, did for the Catholic Church.
Well, she had a great influence in Denver.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's recognized. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, if you have, say, Cuckoo Parish, and St. Cuckoo is not on the calendar, right?
Probably not.
Okay. Will that become
For argument, we'll say no.
Will that become a solemnity, or
It's
just
a solemnity for the parish.
for the parish? Okay.
On feast day, yeah. So that's part of the table of liturgical days, where and celebrations like that come in, and what the rank would be.
Another thought I had was in regard to when I look at this day readings for the week and all, they have a category in there, like for instance tomorrow, which is the Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows.
Yeah.
But it also is it's marked as the Martyrs of Birmingham. I've also seen Martin Luther King referred to in certain liturgical things as a blessed. And so, is that just something that somebody's thrown in there?
Yes.
Or-
Yes. And you might have heard of Martin Luther King as a blessed from the Episcopal Church.
Oh, okay, maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, they tend to do things like that. We tend to be more wait a while.
We'll see.
We'll see about this. Yeah.
What were the votive masses for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday?
Good Lord.
Aid of angels, holy wisdom, and charity.
There, you see, he's got it.
One more time.
Aid of angels,
On Tuesday,
holy wisdom,
on Wednesday,
and charity.
charity on Thursday. Now, the interesting thing is that Alcuin of York could come up with another one for another place. I mean, that's not a universal. It's just the way he did it. And you could use it or not.
What is his name again?
Alcuin of York. He was a Benedictine that assisted Charlemagne in some ways, liturgically. Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Where is the Roman calendar document found? Is that like a literature where it's a separate,
In terms of how it's,
like just published? Is
You'll also find that in here. Yeah. Now you have to hedge your bets a little bit on that because there is a document. The calendar itself is just a listing of the celebrations, you know, day by day, and you'll find that in the missal, etc. But there was a document, universal norms for the, which is also in here, and that gives an explanation of the liturgical calendar in terms of the seasons, and then it will go into some of the saints. There's also a commentary on that, which is probably hardly available here. It was a Roman document that got published unofficially in an official publication over there, which described their process more in detail. Some of the data would come from there. Yeah. Okay. Are we good? Okay. Thank you for your attention. Okay.
When you said there were 2 triduums,
The what?
2 triduums before 1955.
Yeah, referred to in an unofficial way. I'm okay. Yeah, get me off of this.